talk about a very, very important discussion here about human trafficking with somebody who knows all about it. Krishna Patel, who is General Counsel and Justice Initiatives Director at Grace Farms Foundation. For those who don't know Grace Farm Foundation, it is an amazing place in New Canaan, open only a few short years, where all kinds of talk about social justice goes on and music goes on. And we have a couple of pictures that I just want to show to set the scene where you work. Yep. So this is Grace Farm, and enlighten me a little bit about it, Krishna.
So Grace Farms Foundation is a private operating foundation. It opened in October of 2015. It has 5 very specific initiatives. It is free and open to the public. It is open 6 days a week. The only day that we're closed is on Mondays. And it has 5 very specific initiatives. One is nature, another is the arts, community, justice, and faith. And it really is a place where people are invited to actually find various ways to engage in these different initiatives. And I have the privilege of being both currently the General Counsel and also the Director of the Justice Initiative there.
And this is Grace Farms from the air. And it was developed, there's a lot of glass in this building, and I have been there, we were talking
Yes.
about it. It's an amazing place where you look out over the landscape and you have these heady discussions, very important discussions about the 5 things that you brought up. All right, let's get to human trafficking, and thank you so much for coming on. You're an attorney, you have quite a long career in law. How did you end up in this field?
So back in about 1999, I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan. And at that time, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was still something that was being talked about and thought about by folks in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And a lot of what you were seeing around the country in terms of exploitation, particularly within the undocumented population, the severe forms of exploitation that you were seeing were really what you would call modern-day slavery. And we didn't have the laws to really prosecute it in its current form. Our civil rights laws, our slavery laws, the ones that were on the books, were really the laws from that came about from the 13th Amendment, and kind of the ones that came from the indentured servitude that followed the 13th Amendment.
Give me an example of modern-day slavery.
So modern-day slavery right now takes all sorts of different forms. It's everything from the sex trafficking of minors, where you have pimps around our country who are prostituting very young children. And when I say very young children, children who are 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, moving them from state to state and prostituting them, either at strip clubs or in hotel rooms or in private homes.
Where's the money coming from to do all of this?
And the money is coming from those who buy sex, right, from these children. And they advertise them on digital mediums and digital websites. There was a very famous case on Backpage.com that was recently taken down by the federal government that brought a lot of interest and shined a light on the minor sex trafficking. But there's an entire labor side to this entire crime. And we've had very significant labor cases throughout the United States that have taken place in our construction industry, that have taken place in our agriculture industry. And, you know, that involves everyone from Americans to undocumented immigrants who are caught up in essentially slavery. And the slavery that is contemporary slavery, that is human trafficking or modern-day slavery, doesn't require or need the kind of shackles or physical constraints that you recall from the transatlantic slave trade. Because when people don't have documentation, they are terrified of law enforcement. They don't have any rights here. They oftentimes don't know the language. They are not going to go seek refuge from the kind of normal communities. And so it's very easy to take advantage of them. Oftentimes the smugglers know family back home in their home country, so the threats are very easy to make. And so you don't need the same kind of coercive methods that you think of when you think of the transatlantic slave trade.
When we talk about Connecticut, how often does that happen here, where people just disappear?
So here, before I came, I just confirmed the stats for just 2017. So our Department of Children and Families does an extraordinary job in terms of going through and screening every child that hits our foster care system in any way, shape, or form, and to go through a very detailed screening. And it was something that Commissioner Katz put in place back in 2008, has really come through and done an amazing job with these HEART teams, these human anti-trafficking teams. And they go through this kind of very in-depth process to kind of screen all of the children that come through. And in 2012, 212 children were identified here in the state of Connecticut to have been trafficked. That's a pretty substantial number. And these are children who are Connecticut children. These are not all of the other children who come from other states who would then be returned back to their state systems or, you know, their families. And I think one of the biggest myths out there are these are children who come from foster care populations. I believe out of the 212, I think I'm correct on this, about over 140, I think it was about 143 approximately, came from families. These are children who every day...
Kidnapped out of a house.
Or, you know, who get groomed, who get victimized, who are often groomed or recruited through this incredible kind of grooming process, what I call this kind of family myth dynamic that these pimps are so amazingly adept at doing. And
so they infiltrate families.
They are able to groom, you know, children. Mostly, you know, most of our numbers are girls, although there are boys. You know, and they know how to prey on the vulnerabilities of these children, right? And, you know, they become their boyfriends, right? They become their, you know, the person who's going to take care of them. And oftentimes, you know, they're lured, and then you know, they end up in this horrific life, into this entire subculture that is so not at all, you know, what they thought their life was going to be. But I think one of the hardest things for law enforcement is when law enforcement encounters these children, law enforcement is not viewed as the rescuer. They're not viewed as wearing the white hat. There is such an incredible psychological family myth dynamic
and brainwashing,
right, that gets created, that, you know, it's very hard for law enforcement to actually ever be viewed as the white knight when they come in to rescue these children.
You helped write a law.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about it. What does it do, and how does it help in this?
So when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2015, one of the things we really wanted to look at is how to support our state law enforcement to better investigate and prosecute these cases. A lot of, you know, most of the cases here in Connecticut were being handled by the federal authorities, and we really wanted to support our friends in state law enforcement. So we really kind of took a look at the entire state law and did huge comprehensive reforms. So we did many things. 16 and 17-year-old children who are being prostituted should never be seen as criminals. So, you know, if they are being prostituted by pimps, they no longer were viewed as criminals. They were viewed as victims, which they should be, and that kind of matches the federal law, which is if you're under 18 and you're being prostituted, you are a victim. But the other things, you know, we did is the Department of Children and Families refers every case to law enforcement. And so it was really asking law enforcement, you know, what are you doing with these cases? And, you know, asking them to actually, both the police chiefs and the state's attorneys, to now kind of report in to the state legislature in terms of what is happening with these cases, so we can get a better understanding of why they're not getting prosecuted or why they're not getting investigated. So, you know, really understand what tools might be missing. We also did a lot of work in terms of requiring training, particularly in the hotel lodging industry.
Hotels, inns.
Correct. And what we realized, you know, on the federal side is this was a huge point of just where these children were being trafficked. In other words, hotels and motels weren't being complicit, but clearly they were being used in this way. But they were also places, in some cases, that should have really known.
How do you identify a child that's not supposed to be with the person they're with?
And that's a difficult and a complicated question, and there are a lot of different red flags. It's very fact specific, and there are a lot of different red flags. Both DCF's website as well as Polaris's website gives you a whole list of red flags. in terms of what to look for. And oftentimes, like we all do as human beings, we know something's wrong, right? And the most important thing we do is we ask you as a person, just as a human being, not to intervene, because it could be very dangerous, but to report the facts. And if you're not comfortable reporting them to law enforcement, there are incredible hotlines, national hotlines, including one that's run by Polaris, which actually reports into law enforcement, but is actually a 24/7 hotline where there are counselors available who are used to, being able to handle that kind of information.
How widespread is this in our country, across the nation? Do you think people have any idea of what's going on, I'll call it, in the shadows?
So sadly, I think that we have not done, and when I say we, I feel like those of us who've been in this movement for a very long time, and those of us who've been with the department and in law enforcement, we have not done a good job bringing awareness to this issue. I'll give you some global numbers. So the International Labor Organization in 2016 put out numbers, and it was really a very dedicated effort on the part of the international community to try to give some scope to this problem on a global level. And based on a statistical extrapolation of scientific data, but these were the most conservative numbers. In 2016, at any given time, 40.3 million people were enslaved around the world.
Now, that's a staggering figure.
Right. And when you think about the fact that I think, don't quote me completely, but I think during the entire 400 period of this transatlantic slave trade, I think it was about 11 million, right? So when you think of 40.3 million, there are more people enslaved right now than any time in human history. So you are thinking, and this has become the second most profitable crime worldwide. If it continues on the path that it is going, so it has now beat out the weapons industry. The only crime more profitable worldwide is the narcotics industry. And if it continues at the rate it is going, it can beat out the narcotics industry. It is an extraordinarily profitable crime. Human beings have become cheaper. There are more of us, and sadly, they have become a cheaper commodity.
Who's culpable in all of this? We talk about the digital world. What role are they playing in this?
So, I think we are all culpable. There are certain industries where there's a high level of slavery, and what I mean by that is, there's certainly what everybody, everybody sees the movie Taken and thinks it's the sex trade, and the sex trade is a part of it, and certainly here in the U.S., that we are seeing large numbers of the sex trade in terms of a demand culture. But when you look at the numbers globally, 70% of this is labor trafficking. And so when I say we're all culpable, our consumption is tied to the labor trafficking in the world. When you look at the high level of commodities, it's the garment industry where you're seeing a lot of slavery in the supply chain, the electronics industry. So when you look at, for example, our smartphones, the lithium batteries needs cobalt. There's only so many cobalt mines in the world, including the Democratic Republic of Congo. When you look at that, you're seeing children as young as 4 in those mines, right? You're looking at the food industry. There was incredible work done by the AP, actually Pulitzer Prize-winning work done about the Thai shrimp fishing industry. It was the shrimp coming to the United States that was all actually being fished by slaves on various fishing boats around the world, right? You're looking at the cotton industry in terms of raw material, the palm oil industry, and the snack food. You're looking at sugar. And then the other commodities that we've always known, right? Things like conflict diamonds, things like gold. But when you really look at all of our consumption, the mica in our makeup. And so we are all culpable, and what we all need to do as a society is to really push transparency through our corporations.
So how do we do that? There's so much money involved in this. How do we do that? How do we stop this?
There are certain corporations who are doing an amazing job. When you look at Yvon Chouinard, the CEO of Patagonia, he's a man who cared so deeply about the environment that when he actually tasked his employees to see if they could find slavery in their supply chain. And I think I'm correct when I said within 3 weeks, they found slavery in their mills in Taiwan. And he was, I think, so genuinely shocked and saddened that he did something extraordinary, which is he self-reported to the Atlantic and basically told the story, of that, made sweeping changes to push through transparency all the way to the raw material stage, but basically said if it's in our supply chain, it's in every supply chain in the world.
Sure.
And so the first thing, as a corporate entity, we need to know it, and we need to push transparency through. We, as corporate entities, need to actually make sure we are not just looking at our contractor, in whatever country in the world, but we need to go to the subcontractor, and we need to go to the sub-subcontractor, and we need to go all the way to where the raw material is to make sure that the product that we are selling to, the consumer, in Westport, Connecticut, where there's a Patagonia, is free from slavery, right? And you have extraordinary brands doing incredible work, like Adidas. Adidas has an anti-slavery, person who goes through their supply chains. That is that person's job.
How did you end up in this field? Because this is a heavy field.
So I had a very strong interest all the way from the kind of exploitation I was watching in New York. When I came to Connecticut, I had asked the U.S. Attorney at the time if we could start a task force. It was, this was in 2003 when, the term human trafficking wasn't even known. And, I think a lot of people, including our own law enforcement here, federal law enforcement, were very skeptical. By 2005, we had 2 of the largest cases, and not because Connecticut has the largest problem by any means, it's because we were actually looking. And in my first case, which was such a brutal case, I will tell you, most of the victims were not. I don't think any victims were Connecticut victims. There weren't. And my youngest victim was 12 years old.
And what was going on?
And there was a horrific pimp. He was so extraordinarily brutal, and he would move girls, and they were girls, and all around the country. And he would require them to make $500 to $1,000 a day. So these are children who are just being raped day in and day out, right? And he would have them work in strip clubs in Bridgeport and in Hartford. He'd have them work in the casinos in the wintertime. He also moved them from state to state, at different sporting events, would take them to different, places. And when they did not comply, he beat them, he raped them, he cut them, they were hospitalized at different times. And, she walked into a strip club in Bridgeport with a teddy bear, and nobody said anything. And, this is back in 2005, 2006.
Almost yesterday.
And when we finally caught up with her, and I literally put her just to hold on to her, just so she wouldn't run. Basically, in kind of a psychiatric care, and asked her what it would take for her not to run. And the thing, to this day, that really, really has impacted me is she just asked for Harry Potter books. And so we gave her a Harry Potter book a week to get her not to run.
Well, their lives are completely taken over. They have no idea who they are. They just go through the motions. Did you ever think you'd end up in this kind of law?
I always wanted to.
As a kid? I mean, what?
No, probably not this extreme and probably not this brutal. I wanted to do something, around issues relating to women and children, I think. I grew up in the developing world, and so kind of wanted to do things, that might have more of an impact in that way. But the brutality of this particular crime is very extreme.
What are you teaching at Grace Farms Foundation? How are you changing the world there, Krishna?
So we do a lot of things at Grace Farms. We continue a lot of policy advocacy in terms of here in Connecticut. If I could have anything done, it would to have Connecticut be the first slave-free place in the world, right? And I think it's doable. I think that is very doable. Just knowing the state, knowing our law enforcement here, knowing the numbers, knowing the crime here for as long as I do. And I think we could be such a model to the country. I think we'd be a model to the world, but I think we could be a model to the country.
Do you also see yourself on the global stage?
So we have done so much work on the global stage. We've had 2 huge global convenings. around the most brutal form of trafficking of all, and this is the trafficking by non-state terrorist groups. So this is what we saw, which was really disturbing. So there is no greater international norm, legal norm, than the one against slavery. And what I mean by that is it is against the law in every country in the world. And what we began to see in the last 10 years or so are non-state terrorist groups actually creating manifestos where they were bringing slavery back in. So without getting into too much detail, al-Baghdadi for ISIS actually convened a task force and condoned slavery again. And so you saw the slave markets with the Yazidi women and girls. And that was both, a psychological weapon of war, it was a financing tool, it was a recruitment tool. It was horrifying. It was horrifying. And, and we keep saying, we will never let certain things ever happen again, and we do. And we do. The Boko Haram girls, right? It was the same thing. And the Lord's Resistance Army with the child soldiers. We keep, there's certain types of slavery that we keep seeing with these non-terrorist groups coming back. And they're condoning them, and they're putting them in manifestos, and they're saying
part of the law,
right? And they're supporting it. And as the international community, we really have to push back against that. And so we convened 2 huge global convenings. One to work with the think tank, the United Nations University, which is the think tank of the General Assembly, to help them launch a report to inform and help pass the first Security Council resolution, which happened. And I think for me, what was very important was the Security Council is a law enforcement arm of the UN. So they have more ability and capability than the rest of the UN does in terms of actually trying to get at this issue. The second convening was about the money and the financing, and it was really to create financial disruption and to look at the fact that a lot of the money around the non-state terrorist groups was moving through European banks in particular. And how to kind of create a financial disruption around that issue.
And have we done that?
And so we are working on that. I think we convened a very major step. We did something terrific for our country, so we have suspicious activity reports. And what we were able to do with our FinCEN in that convening was to move forward and request very specifically that human trafficking be listed in the suspicious activity report. So any bank that engages in US dollars now has to actually look for that. But more importantly, I think, or as importantly, it was really also to get the financial groups together for the European banks, because they seem to be a more immediate point of entry on some of the terrorist financing involving the non-state terrorist groups, and to figure out different ways to actually cause that disruption. And that work is still ongoing. We're still involved in that work. So on the global work, doing that. We're also working right now on a media campaign, on a global media campaign, and that global media campaign really is targeting how to engage the world.
Is there a tagline to that?
It's called Unchain. Freedom needs Unchain, and it's freedom needs fighters. Freedom needs you. And it's this beautiful hummingbird. Right now there's a very raw cut of the website. It's called unchained.org. And it's about unchaining corporations, it's about unchaining products, unchaining commodities, unchaining ignorance. It was built out by a whole team at WPP, which is one of the largest media marketing advertising conglomerates in the world. It's one of the most beautiful creatives you can imagine. We had put a whole team together with them and worked with them. They actually donated most of this pro bono.
How soon will we see it roll out on television stations and billboards?
We hope so by first quarter 2019 to at least get it started. Shazam created this extraordinary kind of augmented reality around the bird. And so there's just amazing power behind this bird to move it both through traditional media and also social media, with the idea that the millennials are a huge part of this as well. and just looking at consumption, but it really is to move both consumers and corporations to look at consumption and really get an education. You know, one of the biggest things when I talk about our consumption is just help me buy better, teach me how to buy better, and teach me, you know, how to
look beyond what you're using.
Right.
You know, where did this come from?
Right.
You know?
You know, one of the things I tell everybody, you know, there's something called slaveryfootprint.com, where you can just go in and, you know, take a survey about your general buying habits, and through it, you know, you get an idea of how many slaves likely are involved in just your daily consumption. It's through, you know, everything from the furniture to the rugs to the food you eat to the clothes you buy.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, when you think about everything from your makeup to your shoes, right?
So what can we do as we round up this conversation? I could talk for hours on this, and I know you could too. What do we do as everyday citizens to help as foot soldiers?
One is to educate yourself, to become aware of an issue. For me, it's the greatest human rights issue of our time. It really is. I don't think of a crime that is more brutal than slavery. You know, when you think of the idea of people not being free, and you know, the term slavery is different from exploitation. They are not free. They are not free, right? So when we think about that, it has a very specific legal definition, even in our country. And so what I say is become aware, become educated, and then do what you can do. You know, once you know it, you know, to me, you're complicit, you know, if you don't do what you can do. And you know, there is this saying from this anthropologist, you know, people usually get drawn to this crime for the sex. They come for the sex and they stay for the labor. My husband says much like marriage.
Interesting.
But you know, it is a lot of times you're moved by the sex trafficking, but you don't feel like you can do a lot. You can learn about it, and you can certainly support the kind of work, the wonderful work that DCF is doing, and you can certainly, I think, advocate to your state senators and to your state representatives when those bills are there to make sure that our survivors are getting the care, that there's prevention education in our schools. So, you know, just doing simple things like that, you know, an ounce of prevention to make sure that kids know on the front end is so important, not to have our children become victims. But I think the most important thing we can do is learn how to become educated consumers. Do not buy products from companies that are being willfully blind to slavery.
And the best website to find that out?
So if you go to unchained.org right now, in our resources section on the bottom, we are giving you some information on different indices and different ways. It's not easy right now, and part of
you have to want to do it. It's hard.
You have to want to do it. Yeah. It's hard, and part of what we want to do through Unchained is to make that a lot easier. We want to get commitments. You know, there is, I'll be very honest with you, there is a lot of difficulty right now with corporations to say, on the one hand, be transparent, but on the other hand, you know, that transparency could cause brand reputation, can cause legal exposure for corporations. You know, I recognize that. And so we need to do this in a way where you have, you know, Patagonia, who says this is the right thing to do. And to me, reward the Patagonias of the world, right? The companies that are engaging in the remediation, you know, the companies that are willing just to walk in there and say, you know what, the Adidases, the Patagonias that are just saying, we're not, you know, we're not gonna, slavery is just not okay. Right? And we're going to tell our consumers if we find it, we're going to talk about it, and we're just not going to tolerate it in our supply chain. And that's very different from other companies that I won't name, but who continuously are willfully blind to it. Because what they seem to
cheap labor, it's
cheap
easy.
labor.
We're making a buck.
And we're living in a country where it's, you know, it's the quarter to the shareholder. And if you're the shareholder, do you want to know that it's slavery?
That's a big question. Or do you just want to take your money and run?
You know, and I think you have to at some point understand this crime to say, are you really okay with that? Right?
Well, I think you put it best. We're all complicit.
We are. We are.
And we need to work on that.
Yeah. And we're all complicit, and when you understand, you know, it's, so Kaila Satyarthi, who is the Nobel Peace Prize winner with Malala in 2014?
I think.
Yeah. You know, he's rescued over 90,000 children out of child slave labor. And, you know, some of those children in India who made the rugs, if they tried to run away, they broke their bones, so they couldn't run away. You know, how are you feeling as a shareholder, right? Like, that's this crime. That is this crime.
Thank you so much for enlightening us, Krishna Patel.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I hope that we've enlightened a lot of folks.
Thank you. Thank you for taking, thank you for really, thank you for shining a light on this.
You bet.
Spend all night kissing and the bottle's right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked if I'm intuition. Find the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Need to keep locked in the grocery store, but mine just to save time. Skip right ahead to the last ride.